Okay. I was born in the Bronx in New York City, and I lived there until I was 14. The area was kind of a lower middle class area, mainly a white neighborhood, and I was from a family. All of my grandparents came from Eastern Europe and were non-active Jews. My father's family was a very extended family, saved their money to keep bringing people from Europe and lived quite under conditions that were close to poverty. My mother's family was a bit more middle class. And I grew up in a very quiet neighborhood playing baseball with a broom on the street. Until I went to high school. And high school became a bit of an education. I got into one of the 3 specialized schools in New York City, one specializing in science. And it was at the southern end of Manhattan. And I used to travel by subway, by metro, almost the entire length of Manhattan. It was a 45-minute to an hour trip every morning and every afternoon. And that was really when my education started, not so much at school as in the packed train cars, because there you mixed with everyone in the city. You mixed with people speaking different languages, wearing different costumes, having different kinds of fights, and bumping around with you in all kinds of different ways. And so my world opened up really by just being able to travel in the city and enjoy the kind of amazement of what was going on around me. My first reading, when I was about 14, my parents moved out to a suburb of the city. And it was at that time that I really remember the first things that I read that stuck in my mind. The first one was Albert Camus' The Stranger, a very unusual book, a bit isolated and asocial, a book that ignores the Algerian people and talks as a colonial, but a book that captured a kind of a distance from society. He stood as a person thinking about his existence as something that preceded or was beside social life. And it conveyed to me the first sense I had that one could look at the social world and reflect on it without simply taking it for granted. Another thing that I got into in those years was starting to discover jazz, starting to discover the beat generation of the 1950s, the mid-1950s in New York City. I was still, of course, very young and didn't get down to Greenwich Village, which was the center of these activities very often in Lower Manhattan. But before I was eligible to go into the bars and the jazz clubs, I started going, and I remember listening to Nina Simone, an extraordinary black jazz and gospel singer, or gospel influence singer, who first just took me with her music and its power. But then after I had seen her a couple of times, I ended up in a club where she started singing some of her songs about black anger and about black revolution and about black violence. And I remember sitting there kind of amazed, confronted by the world of anger and violence that I had never imagined before. And looking around me and thinking, what do all these other white people in this little room think? And somehow imagining that I was on her side, It was kind of a dream fantasy of someone who was probably 17 years old or 16 years old at the time. But it entered me into the world of understanding that there was a civil rights movement before it became so central to American life, or maybe that's a little strong, before it became so widely known and recognized. And it was part of that just sort of growing up. Somehow, out of all this, I ended up with a critical sense. And when I look back and try and understand that, it kind of amazes me because it preceded the turn to going to Greenwich Village. And I actually think it comes out of the American dream itself. My parents believed in the American dream. They believed that the comfort and well-being of people economically and socially was a reasonable goal, and that after going through the Depression and going through the Second World War, they could see it happening around them and happening in their own lives. What I think was interesting was that that's often portrayed as a kind of a dream that blocked out criticism. And in my parents, I found an awareness of its failures along with a belief in it, and their awareness that it didn't apply to everyone. My father had a small factory making clothing, and many of the workers there became seasonal workers because his clothing was seasonal. And so he was aware of the kind of fragility that the market system was creating. And so out of that, I learned a kind of not very well-developed political and economic critique of what society was in fact achieving. That became kind of personal in a way in the family, because I remember as just a 16-year-old thinking that I resented as a teenager, very centered on myself, I resented my very loving father's departure for 6 or 8 weeks as he traveled all the way to the West Coast and back, selling the clothing that he would deliver in the fall. And thinking to myself, capitalism shouldn't do this to families, even though I had no idea what capitalism was really at that point. But I saw the market disruption of social life in a very personal and a very self-centered way. And I understood, as my father did, the precarity of life of the people who were working, and he worked with unions to try and deal with that. But it was interesting that in the middle of the 50s, there were all of these undertones of social critique and of awareness of both the dream possibilities of development and their difficulties being achieved. I was ready to go to college just after, or not long after, the Russians put Sputnik into orbit. And the pressure was to go into science and help America become great again, as they would say now. And I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York to become a physicist and then a biologist. Spent 2 years there. I entered university when 2 months short of becoming 17. And I was not really ready to take control and organize my life. Did very erratically in the first year and was asked to leave after the second year. And then spent a year out of school working as a bank teller and taking courses at the New School for Social Research and Hunter College. And those were the first encounters I had with social science. They were the first times I got to meet and talk to professors who was systematically thinking about social issues. And I remember one of them telling me that I would spend a good part of my life dealing with social issues, and it was news to me. I was a bank teller at the time. After that year, as I looked around at what to do, I applied back to a number of universities, including Queen's in Canada. At Rensselaer, I had become familiar with some of the Canadian schools because of its proximity to the border. And of all the schools I applied to, only Queen's replied with a sort of a positive answer. Only it was willing to take a chance with my record. And they said, come and take a couple of summer courses, and if you do well, stay. And that's what I did, and I stayed. I didn't realize I was actually going to a very different country until I got there and got here. And a country I came to love and appreciate. But at Queen's, I took a course in philosophy and did well in it and decided to major in philosophy. Maybe I was still running away from physics, and a minor in psychology. It was a department of philosophy that was very formal and logicians and moral philosophers, but I connected with a young American teacher, Webster Hood, who had done his doctorate on Heidegger, and with a professor approaching retirement who was a specialist in American pragmatism, Martin Estill. And they profoundly influenced my way of thinking. During that time, I also was, had to go to the American Draft Board and knew that I would not be willing to serve in the army in a combative role. But at the same time, I was not a religious objector, and I was not an objector with institutional connections to ethical and moral principles. And so I knew I was not eligible for conscientious objector status. The Vietnam War had not developed yet with the American intervention. And so I went and took a risk. I thought probably I won't be needed, and if I am, I'm ready to go to jail. And I was rejected because I was overweight, I had flat feet, and I had asthma, and they didn't need me, essentially. And so I continued study in philosophy. I learned first that philosophy was about asking questions, and asking questions that really couldn't be answered, that you couldn't arrive at final answers to, but that the questioning was the essence. And it's something I took away from it and have found to be very useful. I did, the work I remember doing in philosophy was reading and writing on Spinoza, and reading two strange philosophers, Henry G. Bugby, Jr., an American existentialist, an experiential existentialist, and a psychiatric existentialist, Ludwig Binswanger, German in training, but I think he lived mostly in the US. They really, Bugby in particular, influenced me. I can't recommend him, but he influenced me at that time and place. He wrote philosophy as an exercise in reflection and thought. And he wrote it as a diary of his thoughts, day to day, what he was discovering and encountering. And he illustrated it with experiences out of his own life. So that his book, The Inward Morning, was a philosophical journal, readable and accessible. When I looked it up a couple of years ago, I was surprised to realize that it had developed a big following and was still being used in some circles, not central to philosophy, but in philosophical reflection by people who are not professionals. He had fine things to say and critical things to say about Sartre, Heidegger, Gabriel Marcel. But what I took away from him was first that experience and life are emergent. That being in the world means that we're never outside a flow of life. And that existing never lets us, therefore, take an outside view. I called it sort of the process, meaning that everything was process and I was part of the process. I never did become a serious philosopher, but the philosophy encounter has stuck with me. He illustrated the notion of flow and experience emerging out of being in the world with some stories. Rowing at Princeton and how when rowing flows, it all connects. And you do it and you come through it and you can reflect on it, but it has its own total immersion at the moment. He also, if that was a bit distant from my experience, he took us in other places. He talked about being the captain of a very small ship in the Pacific during the Second World War, and of experiences where he had to bring the ship up alongside a tender to take on fuel and supplies in the middle of the night in high seas, and how, unable to see the waves, you simply had to let yourself go into the flow and work with it. Of course, it didn't save you from the danger of crashing into the larger ship, but it was the only way to do it. It was the only way to live it. So his examples were engaging and captured me, and I think other readers who've looked at him. I realized there were problems with his work because he was thinking as largely an individual who discovered his connection and communion with other people in his reflection. There was no space in that book of his reflection on the political. And he moved in his reflection towards questions of faith and universals that were a bit less interesting to me. But it was there at the right time for me. I took lots of notes. I used it in things I was trying to write about. And because it was influential, I'll give a sample, although they may connect more to me than to listeners. The quest for a completed system is unfair. It doesn't take into account how insight emerges continually, or the limitations of knowledge. He also commented on certainty. Certainty as fixing something that's given is not possible. Our presence as knowers is always affecting and the condition of certainty. So that certainty isn't possessed, it occurs in action rather than in knowing. And he went on like that. Abstraction from intimacy with other people creates an experience that's paltry. We don't control or predict, and we don't control or predict the flow of meaning in our lives and in experience. And finally, insight overtakes us insofar as we're at its disposal. These rather abstract comments really made me think long and through most of my undergraduate career. It's crazy, so I'll telling them to you this way, and I'll stop there. But they kept cropping up in my work after, and you may hear hints of them once in a while. I never did become more than a very casual student of philosophy. In the summer of 1963, I went to Quebec City to read philosophy with some friends, and it was the most important summer of my life because on the boardwalk overlooking the St. Lawrence River, I started up a conversation during a stroll with Luce, who became my wife. And it was a very happy summer, as I can tell you. Back at Queen's, I was getting involved in social movements. This was the early 1960s. Actually, that fall, when I went back to Quebec City, President Kennedy had been assassinated, and I heard it on the radio just as I came back to visit Quebec City in the fall. So it was a time of much political reflection in the country and in the continent. And I started working with the student anti-nuclear campaign and what later became part of the New Left in Canada. So I started learning really more intensely the political world, both the old politics and the claim to the new politics. I also worked as a manager of the Queen's Journal, the student newspaper at Queen's, which was a full-time job besides being a student and an activist. And as graduation approached in 1964, because I had that publication experience, I was asked if I would take over the editorship of the magazine of the Canadian Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. The head offices of the campaign were in Toronto, but the newsletter or newspaper was published in Montreal. And so in the summer of 1964, it was called Sanity. I moved to Montreal to join the editorial group and lead the editorial group. I moved into an apartment with other student activists or youth activists working in labor and the women's rights movement and in the nationalist movement in Quebec, and started to learn about full-time activism and mobilization. By 1965, early 1965, the Canadian Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which was really focused on a single issue of keeping nuclear weapons out of Canada, started to diminish its size and its support and had to close. And the editorial group of Sanity decided that we would continue the publication. I might mention in passing that Sanity had a longer tradition as the name of newspapers in the peace movement. There was a much older magazine in London called Sanity, which was one of Bertrand Russell's, one of the activities that Bertrand Russell was central to keeping alive and to keeping going. So we used a name that didn't come out of the blue but had some meaning in the context. In Montreal, I met a peace activist, Hans Zinn, and he joined the editorial group with a vision of what Sanity could become, and one that I joined him in changing, and that was to turn it into a newspaper and then magazine of lengthy articles of what we called peace, facts, and analysis. It would look to long-term social issues and orient a renewed movement. We identified ourselves as concerning ourselves with nonviolence as a way of life and a philosophy, and we called ourselves radical pacifists in the sense that we wanted to see about how to build an alternate society, how to build on nonviolence. It was a social nonviolence was a social imagination associated with Gandhi, with rural, with old-fashioned social relations. And one of the things we did was what we hoped to do was to try and bring nonviolence into the study of modern society. And so we did articles. I'll just give a sample of the range of things we covered in 3 years. The limitations of the nation state and whether it should be a focus of political action. the uses of water, ecological conscience, and the growing awareness of environmentalism and environmental issues, Quebec's new management, the Quiet Revolution, a guest piece on conversations with American Indians, a piece on diminishing resources and wars over resources, several pieces on women and men and gender, several on wage labor and how it was changing, several on the Black freedom movement, and one that had an influence on economic exchange and social exchange, where I read and wrote about Marshall Solins and the gift economy, and had my first real introduction to anthropology, trying to prepare that article. So.